Reddit. Have you ever had a close encounter with a well-known criminal or serial killer? I'll go first. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. When I was younger, people from my town and the surrounding towns would be invited over to this farm for a barbecue. The farm was, I believe, a pig farm, where the owner would raise his pigs and sell them for meat. Every year, he'd have one of those barbecues where people would show up and eat these pigs. My family never went. It just didn't seem like our thing. Well, little did everyone know that this man, Willie Pickton, had been murdering women and feeding them to his pigs, which he later killed and fed to people at these barbecues. I know tons of people who are vegetarians now who went to these barbecues. Back in 2006, the Phoenix area was being rocked by two men driving around and shooting random people on the streets. While the serial shooters were out wreaking havoc, a serial rapist was also on the prowl. So, needless to say, 2006 was kind of a strange time to be living in the area. Anyway, in the early summer of 2006, two friends of mine from high school moved into an apartment complex about a mile from where I lived, and a lot of us would get together there to party and swim. Both of these friends were girls in their early 20s who mentioned a few times how they had these two creeper neighbors who always gave them a bad vibe. However, this wasn't exactly the best of neighborhoods, so none of us were really shocked to hear this. Well, the summer went on, and the serial shooters' attacks continued. Once they started making their way towards the East Valley, my friends and I opted to stay indoors most nights, as a lot of people did. Unfortunately, another friend of ours from high school, Robin Blasnick, was walking over to her boyfriend's house and wound up being the last victim of the shooters. She was shot about a mile from where I was living at the time. 4 days later, I was heading back to my friend's apartment when I noticed a massive amount of police cars and news vans in front of the complex. The serial shooters, Dale Hausner and Samuel Dietman, were living in the same complex as my two friends, and were the very creeper neighbors they were describing. We spent most of the summer only about 50 yards from their front door, drinking beers and loudly discussing what the possible motivations a person could have for wanting to go around and shooting people at random. Seeing them getting hauled away in handcuffs in the same area as where we spent a lot of time berating them was effing surreal. When I was 15, I was cast in a musical about an hour away from my hometown. My mom didn't want to drive me, but a couple people in the musical could see how important it was to a young teenage "I'm going to be an actress" me, so they offered to drive me to and from the daily rehearsals all summer. I spent hours with this one guy. He was normal, nice enough, constantly hit on me, but whatever. Last year, he was all over the local news for sexually assaulting his neighbor and then chopping her and her boyfriend up and burying their bodies in a local park. The weirdest part was only 2 or 3 days before the murders, I ran into him at a bar. We exchanged numbers and planned to hang out in the near future. Dodge that bullet. About 5 years ago, when I worked in Chiapas, Mexico, I used to go to a country club with my brothers to get some lessons and play a little tennis. There we met an American by the name of Charlie that was there every morning with his wife and young kids. He was a volunteer instructor there, so we played with him and talked to him and his wife a couple of times. I even played with his kids, a boy of about 3 that already could return the ball and play some slow points, and a girl of about 6 that was already winning some kids' tournaments. Suddenly, he stopped going to play, and no one knew why. He just disappeared. A week later, we found out that one of his neighbors found the bodies of his wife and kids inside their house when he smelled the decay from the house. Turned out that they had been dead for a week, and Charlie was missing, apparently on the run. They found his body a month later in a room of a little hotel in Guatemala, where he killed himself. He was an ex-cop from Alaska, wanted for the murder of a woman in Las Vegas, and he escaped to Guadalajara. There he met his wife, whose family later reported as kidnapped. Seems like they just moved to Chiapas and started living there. To me, he just seemed like a good guy with a happy little family that enjoyed to play tennis, so that was pretty shocking. My friend got a chemical burn at work and went to the hospital. While he was there, he held the door open for an Asian man covered in blood being escorted by the police. The next morning, he read about the Tim McLean beheading on the bus outside the town we live in. So he figures he held the door open for Vince Lee hours after he just killed and partially ate a guy. March of 2011, a fairly good friend of mine lost his mind and murdered his twin brother and mother and father with a samurai sword and knives in the suburbs of Philadelphia. When the cops showed up, he was sitting in his driveway covered in blood, and when they asked what happened, he replied only, "Extermination." He then referred to his family members as person called brother and person called father, etc. I also think he was in love with me. Yes, I worked at this nice, clean, and regular-sized cyber bar. My work was about assigning computers to customers, charging them by the hour, and a lot of IRC chatting, lol. My boss always told me that we always had to make the customer feel like I'm home, and we even memorized some of the customers' names to greet them as they walked in. This particular customer was a very polite guy who always said good afternoon when walking in, always at 6 p.m., and thank you when leaving, having been checking email for 15 exact minutes, no more or less. He always paid in exact cash, no big bills and no hassles, just straight to the point. Their hair was always cut in a military way, brush cut, and he didn't talk much. He seemed like another customer to me. One day, two very big guys walked in carrying big .45 caliber pistols, and as we don't see much guns in southern Mexico, I got scared as shit. They started to pop some rude questions, and all I did was to babble some noises. Then this much smaller mustache guy entered and said, "Okay, let me do this to me," in a dominant way, like a dog trainer telling his beast to retreat, lol. He then asks me in a friendly way if I was able to help them to identify some criminal out there. I didn't have a choice, so I got out of the cafe and saw two big vans and two heavily armored federal police trucks out there. The little boss then ordered to open one of the van's doors, and I saw my polite client surrounded by the scary, tall, and muscly looking guys. At this point, I felt bad for my client. Here in Mexico, the police usually pick a random guy at the streets and accuse him for anything they need. So they have someone to show to the press. So I decided to help my customer and said, "I know this man. He's a loyal customer and a good person who always checks his email with us." They not even blinked and asked me about his tennis shoes. "Do you remember what tennis he used to wear?" Stupid question. So I asked, raising my eyebrow, because we used to have a lot of customers. The feds then walked me to my spot at the cafe and told me, "Do not leave the town soon," and parted with police horns and all that shit. Next day, my boss is waiting for me, eyes wide open and pale as a ghost. After I referred my story, he slowly gave me the newspaper, which read, "Serial killer captured at last," with a picture of my polite customer. In his declaratory statement, he said that Satan made him stalk elderly women and then to break in their houses, and then, after beating the shit out of them, he robbed their money and jewelry, only to shoot them in the stomach and cutting their throats and some sick shit. He was captured because some grandma survived and gave the police a detailed description and cooperated in a police sketch. So yes, I tried to help a serial killer to get out of a federal car. Phew, I was so naive at the time. Not famous necessarily, but at my old job we had a huge turnover rate. As a consequence, we'd hire damn near anyone who had a pulse and could read. One day, someone starts there that looks like he'd literally just walked off the prison bus, but before he got to the office. I've seen much worse before, so I don't give him a second thought until he's seated right next to me. As it turns out, he's actually a reasonably nice person trying to turn his life around. We teach him the business, and while he's a slow learner, he puts a great effort into it and ultimately becomes quite successful. He hits a huge level in sales and goes out that Saturday to celebrate. He gets in a fight with some gangbanger and it escalates until my coworker takes out a switchblade and knifes the guy dead. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life. Still bums me out to think about it because he was 23 at the time. I understand he killed someone, but I think in that act, he destroyed his own life as well. My dad told me this story. One time he was dating this girl and she wanted him to come and meet her family. So they drive into the middle of nowhere. She gets out of the car and says, "1 minute." Some random guy comes out of the woods and starts to roll around on the hood of his car, takes a cigarette and then eats it. He throws that shit in reverse and bails. Turns out she meant the Manson family. What? I live a block away from Willie Pickton's old pig farm in Port Coquitlam, BC. I remember coming home from school with helicopters flying all over the place, my family watching the news that night and thinking, holy F. Apparently the elementary school and most of the houses in this area are built on former Pickton land. I was on campus at Virginia Tech on April 16, 2007, 2 buildings over McBride for the Hokies. I left my early class with my professor talking and went back inside when we heard gunshots and saw people running. We sat in MCB 136 for 3 hours, desks blockading the doors, etc., watching everything on CNN. Eerie to see the building you're in on national news. Not good. We had no idea if it was one attacker or an activation of a cell of attackers. I even entertained the idea that someone in every classroom would activate and shoot everyone. We were all looking at each other suspiciously. When the police came to evacuate us, they knocked on the door and said, "Open up, police!" And we were like, F that, slide us a badge. I remember after they slid us a badge under the door, we asked them to slide us a second badge. They did. Then we opened the door and ran like F to the parking lot. I had a full pickup truck, and the police said, if you live on campus, go home with somebody in your class. Nobody's allowed on campus. So I got a literal truckload of classmates and was dropping them off all over the damn place. When we were running from McBride to the commuter lot, I remember we had not been told if it was over or not. I asked the police officer if the killer or killing was over with, and he said, just run, fast. I was thinking there was an attacker on the rooftops, shooting students. We did not know if it was inside classrooms at the time. I remember thinking, if I'm ever going to get a bullet in my brain, it's going to be in the next 30 seconds. Well, this didn't happen to me, but it happened to my mom. When she was about 18 or 19 on her walk home from work at night, a man pulls his car over and calls out to ask for directions. She walked over to his car and started telling him where to go when the guy leans out of his car and attempted to pull her in through the driver's window. It was a few seconds later, a car rounded the corner and started driving up the street. He let her go and drove off. She got a pretty good look at him, and years later, she recognized his face on TV. He was the man being convicted of the NSW backpacking murders in Australia, Ivan Milat. TLDR. My mom was almost pulled into a car by Ivan Milat, the man convicted of the backpacking murders in NSW, Australia. This will get buried. It wasn't, but screw it. I went to visit my aunt in San Francisco when I was a kid, and she decided to take us to Yosemite Park, since she's the outdoorsy type and figured we could take in the scenery and get away from the city. She got the trip all arranged for us, and we have a lovely time hiking and exploring the park. We stayed at a pretty nice motel called the Cedar Lodge. The actual motel is across a highway from a restaurant and a convenience store, plus some other stuff I can't remember. My family, my aunt, uncle, and grandmother goes to dinner at the restaurant, where the food is amazing. The waiter's a nice guy who teases me a little about what I chose for dinner, and overall he's really nice to us. The next day, my uncle goes to buy a lottery ticket. Turns out the guy selling them was our waiter from the other night. My uncle chats with him a little. Afterwards, he remarks how friendly the guy is, and we get on with the rest of our trip. A few weeks later, my aunt frantically calls my grandma. It turns out the nice waiter was this guy who had been murdering women that stayed at the lodge. It turns out we stayed in the lodge during the time period he murdered his victims. We were probably there the same time as one of the victims. He's now on death row in San Quentin. TL, doctor. I stayed in a motel where the handyman liked to murder the female lodgers via decapitating them and burying the bodies. My best friend from high school was down on her luck. She had cheated on her husband with Mark Mayland. Because of the affair, she lost her kid and needed a place to stay. I invited her and the new boyfriend to stay with me. I found out they were on crack and kicked them out. A few weeks later, he beat his dealer to death and hid him in the crawl space under the house they were staying at. She later told me that he did it while she was in the house and could hear the guy moaning under the house while he died. So glad that shit is out of my life. Fred West did my aunt's artexing. No joke. He was known as a handyman in Glasgow, and he also owned an ice cream van, and he told her all about working in the van and stuff, and she remembered he had a strange accent. He's from the Midlands, I believe, and we're in Glasgow. My cousin has the joke that he is a victim of Fred West because when he rolls over in his bed and his hand scrapes off the artexing, Fred West did that to him. My best friend had a bad habit of fulfilling her teenage insecurities in high school by dating random weirdos off the internet. They ranged from awkward shut-in to this guy Rex. She usually had the good sense to have a couple of us hang out at the food court while she entertained these dudes, and thankfully we came to the rescue on her date with Rex. By the time we came to her rescue, he had her cornered in the DVD section at Borders, trying to shove his tongue down her throat. Even when we broke it up and made up some story about her mom sending us to come pick her up because her aunt was in the hospital, he wouldn't give it up. He kept on trying to get handsy and make out with her as he followed us to our vehicle. A year or so ago, same friend and I are in our crime class working on our semester project. We had to find a big case going on in the county, go to the trials, and write an analysis of the forensic evidence. One of our homicide detective professors was very much into was the case of some dude who met a young girl with several mental disabilities on the internet, took her on a date, then took her into the mountains to rape and murder her. I took another case, but my friend was instantly drawn to this one. She tried to go to the trial for her project, but work or school always prevented her from doing. We were talking about it a while ago, and she decides to see what happened. The mugshot of the dude looks eerily familiar. Turns out it was the creeper from Borders, and we collectively shit our pants. He tried to plead not guilty by reason of insanity because velociraptors made him do it. Having met him briefly, I could see that. I've met the Craigslist killer a few times. He's from Verona, New York, and went to an alternative school that houses dropouts and people with mental problems around the county, including Rome. VVS, Vernon, Verona, Sherrill, Camden, and a few others. Well, one of the kids I hung out with there knew him, and we got high a few times. Seemed pretty normal, and was shocked when I heard about it. When I was younger, maybe 9 or 10, we used to hang out with kids in the surrounding neighborhoods. One day, an acquaintances barely knew the kid. His older brother was there with a couple of older kids, maybe 13 or 14 years old. Not sure how we got separated, but before I knew it, I was alone in a bedroom with one of the older kids, and he pinned me on the floor. We were all pretty into wrestling at the time, so I didn't think this was entirely strange, that is, until he had his hands over my mouth and nose and instructed me not to scream. I started to panic. I was small for my age, plus the age-weight difference made it an unfair fight. And thankfully, another kid wandered in at that moment and the guy got off me. He laughed and said we were just kidding around. A few years later, hadn't seen the guy since, when I was in middle school and he was in high school, he lured a young kid selling candy into his house, raped him, strangled him to death, and hid the body in a suitcase in the woods behind his house. Took me years to realize they were the same person. I guess I must have repressed it or something.